The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining today. I'm Avalon Bristow, Program Manager at the Mid-Atlantic Regional Council on the Ocean, or MARCO, and Co-Coordinator for MACAN. Really appreciate you joining us today. We're really excited to be bringing you this webinar, State-Led OA Action Planning in the Mid-Atlantic, along with our partners at the OA Alliance. Our webinar last year featured an overview of OA action planning and included case studies from New York and Maine. And today's agenda will dive deeper into the specific components of OA action planning in Maryland and New Jersey. We're excited to welcome the following speakers for today's, we're excited to welcome many speakers for today's webinar, but before we jump in, I just wanted to remind you that all of MACAN's webinars are recorded and can be found on our website at midacan.org/webinars. And here's a recap of what we've already hosted. So like I said, we have a pretty full agenda today. We have a lot of different speakers lined up. I'm really happy to bring a full agenda to you. First, we will hear from Ava Ibanez from the National Caucus of Environmental Legislators, who will talk about their coastal working group. Ava will then welcome Massachusetts State Representative Dylan Fernandez. Very honored to have him joining us for some additional remarks. Then Jesse Turner from the OA Alliance will give a brief overview of the Alliance and some updates from the U.S. state meeting. We'll then welcome Dr. Jim George to talk about Maryland's ocean action planning. Dr. George is policy advisor with the Water and Science Administration at the Maryland Department of Environment. We'll then learn more about New Jersey's OA action planning from Megan Rutkowski, environmental specialist at New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection's Bureau of Climate Resilience and Planning. And finally, Dr. Grace Saba, assistant professor, Department of Marine and Coastal Sciences at Rutgers University. As you can see, our agenda today is quite full. However, there may be some time at the end for speakers to address a few questions. While everyone will be muted throughout the webinar, please feel free to submit your questions in the questions box at any time during the presentations, and we'll get to them as we have time for at the end. Finally, just one more reminder that this webinar is being recorded and will be available on the MACAN website on the resources page with our previous webinar series. Without further ado, I will turn it over to Ava Ibanez from the National Caucus of Environmental Legislators. Welcome, Ava.
Thank you so much. It is an absolute pleasure to be here with this impressive group of panelists. So for those of you who are not familiar with the National Caucus of Environmental Legislators, or NCEL for short, we are a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization with over 1,000 members. Our members are state legislators from all over the country, and we work as a remote environmental staffers to provide them with resources on a wide range of environmental issues through legislative research, informative sessions, and facilitated collaboration. Importantly, we do not lobby. We inspire, inform, and we facilitate legislative action. So as NCEL's Ocean Policy Fellow and the lead of NCEL's Oceans Program, I am delighted to announce that this June, for World Oceans Day, NCEL will be formally launching its Coastal Working Group, a group of legislators from coastal states working on issues that affect coastal and marine habitats, including ocean acidification. Today, I am honored to welcome one of NCEL's members, Massachusetts Representative Dylan Fernandez. Representative Fernandez has focused on combating climate change and is the co-chair of the Massachusetts Commission on Ocean Acidification, which recently published a report on ocean acidification crisis earlier this year. Representative Fernandez, without further ado, thank you for joining us today. Over to you.
Thank you, Ava, and thank you, MACAN, for having me. I'm here to talk just for a couple of minutes about our ocean acidification report. Before I do, I just want to put in a plug for NCEL. They're an awesome resource for legislators, and they're just so helpful at guiding through legislation and connecting with legislators across the country on these really important issues impacting our oceans. So I'm Dylan Fernandez. I represent part of Cape Cod and Nantucket and Martha's Vineyard and another small island chain. So I represent more coastline than any other state rep in the state. And it's a place that is home to a really robust and diverse shellfishing industry. And I also represent Woods Hole, which I think is familiar to a lot of people on the call for its world-renowned scientific institutions and climate research centers. And so when I saw that states like Maine and Washington and others had filed ocean acidification commissions, but Massachusetts had not, I thought that this was an important gap for us to fill and an important issue for this district and this state to tackle. So we filed and passed legislation back in 2018, and over the past year, that legislation which created the seminal commission on ocean acidification in the state really dug into the issue here in Massachusetts, focusing on coastal issues, understanding that we're not going to be able to solve the global climate crisis, but understanding that a lot of the compounding effects of ocean acidification come from land-based sources that we can affect change around. So our commission was made up of scientists from Woods Hole and elsewhere. It was made up of fishermen and women, and made up of government agency officials and legislators. And over the course of a year, through a global pandemic, the group was able to meet 27 times to really dig into the issue in a deep way and come up with concrete policy recommendations. So we've released a final report, which I hope that folks can be shared with folks after this call. But this is such an important issue for Massachusetts. We have a $500 million fishing industry here, the most productive port in the US, right in New Bedford. And shellfishing really has been a bright spot for our communities, and I think communities everywhere, in that one, it's becoming more and more lucrative and productive, but two, we're actually seeing a lot of young people get involved in it. And it's a real growth industry for a younger cohort that hasn't been as actively involved in other kind of commercial fishing activities. So after a year of really digging in to the science and the regulations and looking to see what other states have done, we released a comprehensive plan that directs the state to do several new things. One is around monitoring. I'm sure this is happening in every state where we have a lot of monitoring across our coastal area, but it's very segmented and very siloed depending on who owns those various monitors. And so in a bill that we filed this session, we aim to have the state make sure that all the different monitoring entities are talking to each other and reporting data to each other, ideally in a real-time way, so that is shared and can be passed down to our scientists and our local fishermen and women. And we also try to put additional funds to more monitoring in the state. We also looked at our regulations here in Massachusetts and have noticed that ocean acidification just isn't a part of our large climate mitigation bills that we have passed. It's not a part of environmental reviews that have to go through state agencies. And so we update the language of our statute to add ocean acidification in really key places to make sure that it is in consideration for when state policies are being rolled out or state regulations are being formed. And we also form a permanent Ocean Acidification Council that has a trust fund. That's really important as well. I know other states have done that. And this is really just to continue the Ocean Acidification Commission's work, understanding that there's just so much that we don't fully know, and it directs this council to do gap analysis on a lot of the science that just doesn't exist right now, because this is really an issue that isn't very new, but it's new enough that we have a lot of knowledge gaps and need to explore a lot further into ocean acidification, its impacts on specific species, its multimodal impacts of OA plus warming and other effects as well. And hopefully this council really dig into that and inform those inform on that science and make appropriate recommendations according to it. And we're also looking at other mechanisms as well, especially a funding mechanism. Maryland's a place we've been looking at, and I see that they're on the call today. The flush tax there, I think, is really interesting for us in Massachusetts. And so we're looking at, in combination with the piece we're putting forward, how can we create more funding to combat ocean acidification and just promote clean water in general? And then also, how do we incentivize our municipalities to create programs and create bylaws that reduce nitrogen and phosphorus loading around coastal, coastal and delicate waterways? And how do we encourage them to have different programs that reduce nitrogen in their own waterways, and also to promote shell fishing, things like having a shell fishing program in town, having a shell collection program and reharvesting. And so there's a lot of other methods that we're looking at and exploring as well through a potential bill that we call the Blue Communities Bill, making sure that communities have a pathway to really taking on ocean acidification at the local level. So really a state and local approach is what we're looking at through combating this. And so with that, that's a little update. Hopefully we can share the report with folks. As always, if you see anything in the report that's interesting to you, or you want to reach out to me directly, please do. My contact information right online, and hopefully the folks on the call can share that with people. So thank you very much, and thanks again to the National Caucus of Environmental Legislators for all their incredible work to coordinate statewide efforts at a national level. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Representative Fernandez. Really appreciate your time today and for sharing all that wealth of information about your work. All right, I'd like to welcome Jesse Turner now, and I'll pull up your presentation, Jesse.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Avalon, you can see and hear me okay? I think yes.
I think so. Yes, I can. Yep. Sorry, I had the PowerPoint open, but yes, I can see you. You're good.
Great, great. Well, thank you, MACAN, for co-hosting today. Thank you, Rep. Fernandez. It is so inspiring to see the recommendations rolled out from the hard work of you and your colleagues of the state of Massachusetts. Wow, wow, wow. Incredible rundown just now, and really delighted to be in community with you all, as well as folks on the line here who are starting to really make progress on thinking about this state application and regional partnership application of some of this work. And really delighted to hear you, Rep. Fernandez, talk about that state to local scale and then regional umbrellas. So that's really delightful news. And thank you, of course, National Caucus of Environmental Legislators for partnering with us on this type of work, and look forward to more of that in the future. So for those of you that are new to the Alliance, I just want to give a little bit of overview about our work to root the next couple presentations that have to do with these OA action plans. So my name is Jesse Turner, and I'm the program manager for the International Alliance to Combat Ocean Acidification. And again, very grateful for the members and partners that are here today, and of course, always happy for the chance to welcome new friends into this work. So we were created in 2016 by the 3 state governments of California, Oregon, Washington, and the province of British Columbia in Canada in direct response to some of the first ever observed impacts of ocean acidification on oyster hatchery production across the North American West Coast. And it was because of these early impacts that shellfish growers, tribal governments, and state governments got activated early, really laying the foundation for the Alliance to seek engagement on this issue from other governments and organizations around the world. So next slide, Avalon. So together, members of the Alliance, we are working to elevate urgency and ambition for climate action, integrate ocean into climate commitments, and translate knowledge into policy actions, which really takes the shape of these OA action plans. So I'm going to quickly highlight our membership for context in the next slide. And today's meeting is tailored for US state members across Mid-Atlantic region. However, we do have an ever-growing network of national, state, tribal, and municipal governments, to Rep. Fernandez's comment and point, along with many affiliate members like NGOs, universities, fishing or shellfish growers associations. And in the next slide for context, I'm just going to give a quick little list of our current US state members, though of course we're always excited to welcome new members at any time. Quick next slide, Avalon, thank you. So in order to engage our members and help accomplish our collective goals, the Alliance calls for the creation of what we call these OA action plans, which of course is the focus of today's webinar. And action plans help identify the types of actions that governments will take or are taking to better understand and respond to the threat of ocean and coastal acidification and other related impacts within their regions. And so today you're going to hear from 2 states who are at different stages of approving and adopting an action plan, or drafting the set of recommendations that will inform their plan. And many of you on the line have already undergone some sort of process to draft recommendations. And so from the Alliance perspective, it's important to note that we really feel there's no one-size-fits-all approach. Some states are going to have these standalone action plans. Others may choose to integrate relevant OA science, research, mitigation, adaptation strategies across a suite of applicable policies and programs that could be related to ocean, coastal, or climate policies. And importantly, some action plans have actually been directly commissioned by a state legislature, and many, however, will need ongoing implementation and funding support from state legislatures. So I think it's a really great way to think about different roles for different types of actors in this process. All right, next slide, Avalon. So it's our view that however a state chooses to approach this process, that creating this action plan, partners in the region will have an increased ability to better understand local variabilities and really take stock of unique vulnerabilities and trends. We want to establish a deeper connection between the science in the region, which ideally will help prioritize new studies and improve local management. We want to strengthen the federal, state, and private funding opportunities for OA or ocean and coastal related projects. And again, that we want to further implement some of these existing climate, ocean, and coastal commitments and policy priorities. As Rep. Fernandez mentioned, a lot of times you've got these climate mitigation or adaptation policies or strategies that don't have any emphasis or inclusion of ocean and coastal change or impacts like ocean acidification. And that creating these action plans and putting these recommendations together can further bolster those existing priorities that are already moving forward. So next, quick 2 slides. How are US state members helping to elevate OA and ocean across climate policies and frameworks? And I just want to give you all in the audience a little bit of context for this. So for next slide, even during 2020, OA Alliance members were able to demonstrate leadership by participating at events like virtual UN Climate Week, which included high-level representation from the states of Washington, California, Maine, Maryland, Hawaii, alongside Senator Whitehouse in the state of Rhode Island and Congresswoman Bonamici in the state of Oregon. We also have had really enjoyed an ever-growing US state representation at events like the UNFCCC COPs or the UN climate change conferences, as shown here at COP25, which was held in Madrid in 2019. Next slide. And so at the end of 2020, we held an end of the year meeting for US state members and partners. And I quickly just want to give you a sense of the engagement and discussions we had relevant to state-led OA action planning. We were able to hear from NOAA OAP about the research and funding priorities, which include commissioning 3 regional vulnerability assessments, understanding OA intersections with harmful algal blooms, and increased funding for aquaculture research. EPA joined us and gave an overview of the 7 National Estuary Program ocean and coastal acidification projects that are engaging state actors, and really emphasize that EPA's focus will be on continuing to improve models that will help states better assess economic impacts of OCA. Next slide. We heard presentations about the Ocean-Based Climate Solutions Act of 2020, which is in federal in Congress, which includes a suite of climate and ocean-related mitigation adaptation priorities, funding opportunities for states, including those related to coordinated monitoring, shoreline and coastal restoration projects, climate-prepared fisheries and aquaculture projects and priorities. We talked a little bit about the importance of coordinated regional monitoring that can better inform or support state or federal decision-making. And so we've got some examples here on the West Coast of that type of work moving forward, including an inventory and gaps analysis, and looking forward to more discussions at other regional scales about what that could look like. And finally, we did a little plug. There will be an ocean and coastal acidification special issue of Coastal Management Journal, which is slated for publication this year. And we'll want to make sure that everyone who's joined us today gets access to that special issue that covers these topics in a little bit more detail from a state perspective. So next slide. What's next for the Alliance this year? Just noting that we want to continue to support and advance these state-led OA action planning efforts that are happening now in the state of New Jersey, Maryland, Virginia, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Hawaii. We want to support the Mid-Atlantic Coastal Acidification Network, who will be hosting a workshop regarding the establishment of such a regional monitoring network that will help better inform state and local decision-making and management choices. So we'll hear a little bit more about that at the end of this webinar. And finally, we're going to continue to advance climate leadership across a number of high-level events this year, including at the upcoming U.S. Leadership Summit on Climate that's being hosted by the Biden administration, as well as things like Capitol Hill Ocean Week, UN Climate Week, and COP26. And so finally, I just want to leave you with this last slide and really an invitation, which is shown in this infographic that was recently created by the Alliance, and it more or less says, who is considered an OA policymaker? And as you can see here, I really want to suggest that there is a role for you in this work. If you are a legislator, if you're a tribal leader, agency head, or department manager, regional governance council, local government authority, there is a role for you to play. And because OA is such a multi-sectoral issue, relevant to this climate mitigation adaptation, ocean and land management, food security, coastal resilience, aquaculture, and fisheries, it really is essential that there's this high level of coordination between ocean and climate experts and policy implementers. And it's really our aim that action plans will help demonstrate and advance that type of integration across government and management programs and in collaboration with regional partners and federal actors. So with that, I hope I've set a little bit of context for OA action planning as envisioned by the Alliance, and really thrilled to turn it over to the states of Maryland and New Jersey to dive in further.
Thank you so much, Jessie. Really appreciate that. And with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Jim George out of Maryland, and pulling up your presentation now. There we go.
Thank you, Avalon. And I want to thank the OA Alliance and MACAN for inviting Maryland to present today. I also wanted to acknowledge Mark Trice from the Maryland Department of Natural Resources, who really has far more experience with ocean acidification than I have. He was staff to Maryland's 2015 our task force on ocean acidification and an author of Maryland's 2020 OA action plan. Next slide, please, Evelyn. So the Chesapeake Bay is a very prominent geographical feature for the state of Maryland, shown on this map. For many, particularly in the eastern part of Maryland, people's heritage and culture have a strong link to the Chesapeake Bay. Having a crab feast each summer is pretty much an annual rite of passage for many people in Maryland. Therefore, we see acidification through the lens of how it affects the Chesapeake Bay and to some extent our Maryland coastal bays. Next slide, please. So Maryland's 2020 action plan can best be understood in the context of work that was conducted in 2015 by the Maryland Task Force on Ocean Acidification. And that task force was established by law in 2014. And the bill was called the Bay Acidification Bill. And the task force had broad representation from science community, state agencies, Maryland legislature, Maryland seafood industry, as well as environmental advocacy groups. And the report was published in 2015 for the legislature and the governor's office. Next slide, please. So the task force identified 7 areas of recommendations that you can see here. And I won't go into them, but suffice to say, Maryland's OA action plan uses these recommendations as a guiding foundation. Next slide, please. So Maryland's OA action plan is a very short document. It's only 18 pages, and that includes the cover page and references. And we used the OA Alliance action plan template as the basis for our plan. The plan was developed by a small group, Maryland Department of Environment, the Maryland Department of Natural Resources, and University of Maryland's Center for Environmental Sciences. We had modest stakeholder involvement during the plan development. However, we benefited from significant stakeholder involvement in the 2015 task force undertaking as well as their report. Maryland's Commission on Climate Change, which was established in 2015, serves as a primary stakeholder advisory body. So Maryland's Climate Commission also has very wide representation, which is another way that our plan was informed. And the Climate Commission's Science and Technology Work Group, one of 4 work groups under the Commission, provided written comments on our action plan. Next slide, please. Maryland's action plan has 3 broad theme areas. One is reducing the causes and increasing resilience to acidification. Second is improving scientific understanding. And third is expanding public awareness and partnerships for action. So I'll go through these 3 themes in the following slides. Next slide, please. So Maryland has a very robust set of strategies for reducing the 2 primary causes of acidification in the Chesapeake Bay. One is Maryland's Chesapeake Bay nutrient reduction strategy, and the other is Maryland's greenhouse gas reduction plan. An interesting scientific finding that was recently published is that about 50% of the acidification in the lower Chesapeake Bay is due to atmospheric CO2. The other 50% is due to changes in biological processes associated with over-enrichment of nutrients. With regard to increasing resilience, Maryland's OA action plan is very research-oriented. Recently, for example, the Department of Environment supported a student capstone paper on options for Maryland's oyster aquaculture industry to adapt to and be more resilient to acidification. The paper's founded on a vulnerability reduction framework, reducing the risk of impact by reducing exposure, the sensitivity of the oysters, as well as opportunities for adaptation. So adapting to coastal acidification is really still an emerging issue, and for this reason, it really does fit into our priorities of better understanding science. Next slide, please. One of our priorities is ecosystems monitoring and modeling, which I'll go into in some more detail in a future slide. But I wanted to say that the methods for reducing the causes of ocean acidification, as noted, Maryland has two major strategies, the nutrient reduction strategy as well as the greenhouse gas reduction strategy. Third, however, which I've not mentioned, is a climate change resilience building strategy, which is really regarding climate adaptation. Next slide, please. We're kind of taking an approach that's represented by this example here. This is kind of a conceptual example. So given limited resources that most states have, if not all, it's really vital that we identify and quantify the costs and benefits of individual best management practices. It can have multiple benefits. So in this example, for instance, we have a flooded road here that is a problem in itself. And resolving this problem can help meet local NPDES stormwater permit goals. It also provides the obvious flood mitigation benefit. The constructed wetland also has an opportunity to sequester carbon to meet our greenhouse gas and OA goals. The same project can reduce nutrients to improve the Chesapeake Bay and local water quality, as well as lower acidity associated with excessive nutrients. And the project, if it were designed in a way to include crushed limestone, say, underlying the wetland, it could have pH buffering benefits, similar to the passive treatment systems that some people may be aware of with regard to acid mine drainage pollution control. Finally, the same project, if properly targeted geographically, could provide resilience to an oyster aquaculture growing operation by managing the localized nutrients and freshwater inputs. So we're really striving to find multiple benefits associated with similar or the same projects. Next slide, please. As noted previously, we have a priority to research ways in which to increase the resilience of ecosystems by better understanding their dynamics, which are linked to Maryland's economy and culture. This is perhaps best represented by a research initiative being conducted by the University of Maryland Center for Environmental Sciences under a NOAA grant by Dr. Jeremy Testa. The project's using regional downscaling of future climate conditions to quantify current and future, say, mid-century acidification of the Chesapeake Bay. They're coupling these simulations with a model of oyster growth that responds to the warming, changes in salinity, food availability, and acidification. These responses will then drive an aquaculture economic model that determines the profitability of the aquaculture industry and the cost of mitigation efforts. So it's really a very integrated study, and it's generating a lot of interesting results. I think one of the results is that 50% factoid I gave a little while back. And as a tangible step in monitoring, we're exploring the adoption of PCO2 probes, as well as total alkalinity sampling at existing monitoring stations managed by the Department of Environment and the Department of Natural Resources in collaboration with Jeremy Testa of the University of Maryland Center for Environmental Sciences. Next slide, please. And I'll speed it up here. So in terms of expanding public awareness, our OA plan really kind of lays out guiding principles. It doesn't specify particular actions. First is to identify 3 key audiences, which are reflected here. Second is to institutionalize our communication strategy within the Commission on Climate Change, which has an education, outreach, and communications work group. This is designed to really create a sustained action by institutionalizing it within this body. And finally, we plan to assess our progress by measuring through surveys and that type of thing. Next slide, please. So let me just wrap up by saying it's kind of hard to really describe all of the partnerships that we have. There's so many, but they're kind of organized in terms of this goals of building resilience and reducing the causes, as well as better understanding the science. I won't go into a lot of detail on this to save time, but it's like being an award winner where you have to thank everybody, and once you start, you really can't stop. We have lots of great partnerships, and they're continuing to grow. Again, thank you for the opportunity to describe Maryland's OA action plan. And if you have questions, they're happy to take them.
Thank you so much, Jim. Really appreciate your time today. With that, I'd like to welcome Megan Rutkowski from New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection. Megan, do we have you? There we go. I see you now. Thank you. Thanks very much.
Hi, I'm Megan Rutkowski. I'm with the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection's Bureau of Climate Resilience Planning. So today I just wanted to give you a quick background on our state's evolving work in the realm of ocean acidification planning that has come out of our larger climate resilience planning efforts. Next slide, please. Okay, so our climate resilience planning efforts kind of started with our executive order number 89, which addressed climate resilience and was signed by Governor Murphy on October 29th in 2019. So this directed the DEP, among other things, to create a scientific report on climate change and also a statewide climate change resilience strategy. This strategy also included, or will include, within it, a coastal resilience plan. So just a quick side note on the climate resilience plan, since it's being shown here on a timeline. So this was set for release earlier, but of course, due to the pandemic, it had to be pushed back. So as of right now, the draft is set for release on Earth Day, with a final document released at the end of May after our public comment period. So stay tuned for that one. So also, those of us with an interest in OA and its effects in New Jersey, we've had a few lofty goals now for a while. First of which was we needed to make sure that OA science found its place into the scientific report. Next slide, please. So that goal we were able to meet. New Jersey's first scientific report on climate change was released on our website on June 30th of last year, complete with an OA chapter as specific to New Jersey as the research would allow. So our report will be updated at least every 2 years. So yes, that means a year from now, and I'm trying not to think about that. So next slide, please. All right, so some things we learned from the science is that New Jersey is predicted to be at a high risk of economic harm from OA conditions. So why is this? Well, for one thing, southern New Jersey counties are ranked second in the US in economic dependence on shellfish, which will suffer from increasing ocean acidity. Also, in addition to ocean acidification, our coastal ecosystems will be affected by such local amplifiers as eutrophication, freshwater runoff, and upwelling. Next slide, please. All right, so another goal is to prepare New Jersey's first OA action plan, which is the main focus of this. So to this end, under the umbrella of New Jersey's Coastal Management Program, the Bureau of Climate Resilience Planning and the Bureau of Marine Water Monitoring got together to form New Jersey's OA team. So our OA team then engaged the New Jersey Climate Change Resource Center at Rutgers University in order to gain insight into a few things, such as filling the knowledge gaps in the scientific understanding of OA impacts in New Jersey that we identified in the scientific report, and also learning from the experiences of other coastal states regarding their OA action planning process. The states that have come before us, like what worked for them, what didn't, where is New Jersey similar. So outlining what elements New Jersey can use in our OA action plan, as well as a roadmap for how we might get there. Next slide, please. Right. So as a first step moving forward, our OA team has expanded internally to include partners from across New Jersey's coastal management program. So now we're including, in addition to our bureaus of climate resilience planning and marine water monitoring, are also our Bureau of Shell Fisheries, Division of Science and Research, and also our Air Quality, Energy, and Sustainability program. Next slide, please. All right. So the OA team and the team at Rutgers are now working together again in order to begin the process of building an OA monitoring network in New Jersey. In a few minutes, Dr. Grace Saba will talk a little more about this. So we hope in the coming months to work also toward extending our stakeholder network outside of the DEP, especially to our fisheries and shell fisheries groups, as well as officially joining the OA Alliance. Speaking of which, I do have a little bit of a happy news to share, a little off-slide news, so to speak. We have officially been given the green light to join the OA Alliance as state of New Jersey, finally. So we will be making this official announcement by way of our Earth Day or Earth Week social media campaign. But I personally am very excited about this. I couldn't resist letting you all know about that today since I had the opportunity.
Hold for applause, hold for applause. Yay.
This has been it's been a 2-year process coming from New Jersey, so we are very excited. All right, next slide, please. All right, so thank you. Feel free to contact me with any questions about anything OA going on in New Jersey. And thanks and a shout out to my OA team.
Thank you so much, Megan. And with that, we can turn it over to Dr. Grace Saba, and I'll pull up your presentation.
Hello, can you hear me?
I can.
Perfect. Okay. All right. Thanks for starting that off, Megan. That was a good segue into getting a little bit into more specifics on the work that we have been doing with NJDEP's coastal management program and their OA team. So she did touch on this a bit. So we had some goals in our first round of collaboration, and that was working towards developing a framework for an OA action plan for the state of New Jersey. And so there were kind of 3 parts to that. The first one was learning about OA action plan efforts in other states. So we did a round of interviews with all of these states listed here, some of which were already members of the OA Alliance, and other states that were working towards that, or were just beginning discussions on any kind of ocean acidification plans. So we did those interviews, and the key takeaways from that were on the next slide at Avalon. Thank you. Developing a comprehensive statewide monitoring network is an essential foundation to a state OA initiative. And I have this in bold because Megan touched on this a bit, but that's what I'll focus a little bit more on that one near the end of my presentation here. So that was pretty much agreed on by almost all of the states we interviewed that were members of the OA Alliance, was that kind of that step into developing that comprehensive statewide monitoring network is really important. And that's Representative Fernandez touched on this at the beginning of this webinar also, because, you know, just the fact that all the monitoring efforts are pretty independent of each other. There's not a lot of communication or data sharing yet. And there's not really like one place where all the data is held and shared and communicated. So that becomes really important in trying to identify gaps and to fill gaps, really. The second key takeaway was identifying state research needs and proactively reaching out to scientists is important in achieving action items identified in OA initiatives. And that's really filling those research gaps, filling those monitoring gaps that are really important to state objectives. The third one was engaging stakeholders is essential to advancing a coordinated OA initiative. And that's just so that the stakeholders are aware of the implications for ocean acidification, but also, you know, if they are concerned or if they have concerns, which we we want to know what those are and see how we can proactively address those concerns. Ensure any commitments made to address ocean acidification are feasible, given the resources, authority, stakeholder interests, and level of coordination needed between agencies. So those are the 4 key takeaways that we took from discussing the OA action planning with the other states that we are then using for the state of New Jersey for the action planning. It's fine, Avalon, go ahead. The second goal with our first collaborative effort was to identify knowledge gaps for the state regarding OA science. And a lot of this came from the MACAN working groups that published the 2 white papers in 2019. One focused on ecological research and the other one focused on observation. So we looked at those again and tried to make that as specific as we could for the state of New Jersey. Next slide. So in terms of ecological research, this was a table pulled out from one of those white papers, and with the motivation that there are many commercially and recreational important species in New Jersey waters. A majority of those responses a majority of the responses of those organisms to ocean acidification are negative. So they have most of them have negative responses to ocean acidification based on laboratory studies that have been conducted thus far. And then there are several species that are managed, up to 69%, that have not yet been investigated for acidification impacts. So a pretty high number of pretty important organisms in our region that we don't know how they're going to respond to acidification. So that was one thing we highlighted through this collaborative effort as well. Next slide. But in terms of what we're talking about today, it's really observations, and I'll get into that when a little bit in just a moment. But so the observations needs that we highlighted through this effort was we need high sampling frequency, especially in such a dynamic coastal environment that we're surrounded by. We need measurements of multiple carbonate chemistry parameters. Some of these observation programs are only measuring 1, like pH, for instance, but you really need 2 in order to fully characterize the carbonate system and look at things like saturation states that are important for calcifying organisms. We need high resolution depth profiling measurements. A lot of the measurements we have in the region are from surface, are in surface waters. We don't have a lot of information for subsurface waters. We also highlighted that it was important to monitor across the salinity gradient. We have a lot of freshwater systems, estuarine systems in the region that are critically important to organisms. And so increasing that monitoring across the salinity gradient will help us better understand causes of acidification and magnitude of acidification in certain regions. Observing ocean acidification with other stressors was important. So OA doesn't occur alone. It's typically accompanied by warming temperatures or low dissolved oxygen, so that was important. And then co-locating the biological responses with the monitoring so that we can see biological impacts potentially. Next slide. And then we highlighted some opportunities to fill monitoring gaps in New Jersey coastal waters. And those included using a repository of ongoing ocean acidification monitoring locations and cruises, coordinating with partner agencies to add carbonate chemistry parameters to existing monitoring stations, enhancing nearshore monitoring using gliders, so augmenting existing glider deployments with new sensors, and partnering with industry groups like hatcheries, which is seen in this figure, to begin monitoring economic sites of interest. So how do we do that? Next slide, Avalon. In order to coordinate something like that, we would benefit from a comprehensive statewide monitoring network that can cohesively act to address these observation needs. So it's really a matter of trying to put that together in a cohesive unit or network in order to kind of coordinate all of those activities in order to fill the gaps. Next slide, Avalon. Okay, so the work we've done so far was culminated into a document for the New Jersey Coastal Management Program that summarized all of these things in a report. But now what we're working on, next slide, Avalon, is to develop, we're now working with between Rutgers and New Jersey Coastal Management Program, we're working to develop a statewide acidification monitoring network in New Jersey. Next slide. Thank you. And the tasks for that are included here. But essentially, we want to identify and engage potential partners to plan for a statewide acidification monitoring network. Those partners would include entities that are currently collecting carbonate chemistry data in New Jersey state waters, as well as entities that might not currently be collecting data, but their participation could be vital for future optimized or expanded monitoring. So offshore wind platforms, things like industry, so commercial shell fisheries and fin fisheries. Task 2 would be to convene a virtual workshop to outline the approach for developing a statewide acidification monitoring network. And this becomes important because we want to get all these partners in the room together so that we can really review the existing acidification monitoring in the region, summarize locations, time periods, next steps needed to develop and coordinate a monitoring network, discuss the required costs, logistics, personnel that might be needed to coordinate and maintain a monitoring network, and then discussing strategies for communication engagement with stakeholders. And then that leads us to task 3, which would be engaging stakeholders in that proposed monitoring network. And that would be really for 3 reasons. And the first one would be to convey how the statewide monitoring network would greatly enhance knowledge on potential risks to specific species and ecosystems in New Jersey, and then to obtain feedback on their interest and willingness to develop partnerships between them and the observing community for utilizing their facilities, and then facilities to optimize or expand the acidification network, and then to just obtain feedback on logistical considerations for adding carbonate chemistry sensors into their operations to incorporate into a potential monitoring network. So that's we're going to be working together to plan a workshop in order to discuss all of these things. So we're really at the very beginning step of this process, but we are excited about it. And I think that's it. I think last slide is my thank you slide. Yeah, thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Grace. Really appreciate you joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Great, so I just have a few wrap up slides. All right, so as has been mentioned, we heard a couple of folks talking about the need for coordinated monitoring. So toward that end, and also there's a lot of interest in this region for states pursuing OA action planning. So MACAN has again partnered with the OA Alliance to host a virtual workshop in fall of 2021, likely the second week in October. Final dates and times are to be determined still, but the workshop is going to be a deeper dive into OA action planning and will seek to build connections between researchers, state agencies, representatives from state legislators from across the Mid-Atlantic to help inform OA action planning, identify associated data needs, and coordinate monitoring where appropriate. We will be sending out more information about this in the coming weeks, so please look out for that, and we hope you'll join us when that is scheduled. If you have any questions that are not able to be answered today, I think we do have just a few minutes, but please feel free to reach out to me. My email is here. You can also reach out to info@midacan.org and somebody will get back to you. And like we mentioned, the webinar recording will be available soon to midacan.org. I really want to thank all of our speakers today for joining us and for all of you for joining and viewing. I think we We maybe have about 5 minutes. I'm not sure if folks have been adding questions to the questions box here. I see we do have a question for Representative Fernandez, who is no longer with us, but I'm not sure whether Ava will be able to address this on his behalf or be able to forward this question to him. But there was a question about what outreach was done with local communities and how did that process go? Was there an overall appreciation of OA issues? So not sure if Ava wants to jump in or if there's anybody else from a state that could talk about outreach that we might be able to address that question.
Hi, so in terms of Representative Fernandez's work, I would defer to him to really talk about how the commission really engaged with communities. But I would be happy to pass on that question and get an answer for the participant.
Thank you very much, Ava. Did I see Grace joining as well? I'm not sure if Grace has something to add to that. You might be on mute.
Sorry. No, I was just answering to the comment that says all panelists come on to the video.
Oh, no worries.
But I'll turn it off unless I'm answering something.
Great, no problem. Okay. Oh, there is one additional question that we'll go ahead and do our best to address, and I think we could have all panelists join if you would like. So this question is about, asking why is it that we need a coordinated regional monitoring program, and why don't we just focus on adaptation or mitigation? They characterize it as a devil's advocate kind of question, so wanting people to speak to that a little bit. So I welcome any panelists to sort of jump in and take a crack at answering that. I see Jesse's on the line here.
Well, I was going to defer and call to Jim, Grace, or Megan to think about that. But what I would just quickly say is that from the West Coast perspective, there are questions and trends that really apply at a regional scale, and that and having that information is most applicable at that sort of level, and that there's tons of information sharing. As we know, ocean and coastal change doesn't have state boundaries. Of course, there are unique state-specific hotspots and freshwater inputs that will be unique and specific. But that's really how the West Coast has thought about this effort from a regional perspective. But states.
Yeah, I'll just add that, it's like we mentioned before, a lot of the monitoring efforts are kind of just independent, and they're not, sometimes you don't know where to find them. And I just remember going through this exercise working with Marco when we tried to develop we did successfully develop the Mid-Atlantic ocean acidification monitoring sites on their ocean data portal. And I just remember having a hard time finding where people were even collecting data. And it's really about cost and being effective and not, overlapping too much to where you can really fill gaps. If you're communicating and you have all the bases covered, you can use additional resources into really targeting specific locations or times where you need that additional sampling that might be really important to a commercial, fishery or something. So it's important just to have that communication and that kind of just single network or database to allow you to figure those things out.
Great, we have 1 more minute in case Jim would like to add something. Jim.
I'll just say that I share some of the thinking of the person who asked the question, and we did try to make an effort not to fall into the pattern of our OA action being all about monitoring. We recognize that sometimes you get the scientists involved in this, and the inclination is to go towards monitoring and monitoring strategies. It certainly is important for us to have that baseline information and that trend information about how things are changing. Plus, in these coastal areas, it's extremely complex what's going on. There's so many factors involved, and as Grace mentioned, the variability is very hard to manage in terms of the data. So it's hard to do monitoring without going in pretty far because of that variability. So we're taking some, I mean, we're fortunate to have a NOAA buoy at the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay, and to have some good researchers who are doing, intensive sampling over shorter periods of time. But we think, we kind of are exploring the responsibility of having longer term trends of multiple parameters like Grace mentioned in the Chesapeake Bay without breaking the bank. We are trying to put a lot more thought into really how to reduce the causes and how can we adapt should that need become more severe in the Chesapeake.
Great. Well, thank you everyone for your time today. I know we did not get to everybody's question, but if you would like to follow up and get your question addressed, please do email me and I can forward it along to the appropriate presenter to respond. And thank you very much. I hope you have a wonderful week ahead.
Thanks all.
Bye-bye.
Bye, thank you.